Well, I think we pretty much wore out our substitutionary atonement discussion, and hopefully we have a good sense of where that came from, kind of what it represents. But what I want to do for the second half here is talk about the other end of the spectrum, understanding the Paschal mystery, not so much in terms of substitutionary atonement or atonement theory, but in terms of love. Okay, thank you. And so to kind of help in this transition over, I came across this piece that I thought was well written, and I just want to share it here as part of our transition. So let's be clear. The cross is not about the appeasement of a monster God. The cross is about the revelation of a merciful God. At the cross we discover a God who would rather die than kill his enemies. The cross is where God in Christ absorbs sin and recycles it into forgiveness. The cross is not what God inflicts upon Christ in order to forgive. The cross is what God endures in Christ as he forgives. Once we understand this, we know what we are seeing when we look at the cross. We are seeing the lengths to which a God of love will go in forgiving sin. The cross is both ugly and beautiful. It's as ugly as human sin and as beautiful as divine love. But in the end, love and beauty win. So,
who wrote that?
It's a fellow named Brian Zahn. I was reading as much as I could, and I came across that, and I liked it, so I printed. But I don't think this is a scholar of any repute that anybody would be that familiar with or anything. So, but I think that was a really insightful exchange, and it's a perfect way for us, I think, to think about kind of moving from the left to the right here, because one of the things we really didn't talk about much, is what is our understanding of God, the Creator, the Father, Source, how we want to refer to God, in this kind of understanding. If you read enough about substitutionary atonement, and especially about the more extreme parts, the penal substitutionary, God needs a sacrifice in order to kind of make things right. I mean, there is sort of that sense of imbalance only being restored, by the shedding of blood. And that's there. That's part of our tradition. It's never, ever made any sense to me personally. Even before I started thinking in terms of atonement and Paschal mystery and all that, as I grew up in Catholic school and went through Catholic education and Catholic college and all of that, this sense that the world is off somehow, that we are off, that the only way things are made right was by some sacrifice of Christ to God on our behalf. I don't know. It just never worked. It still doesn't work. I have a really hard time operating, with my personal cosmology on this end of the spectrum. I have to be over here because it's the only thing that makes sense to me personally.
Can I say something?
Yes.
When I look at the Old Testament and God, we talk about God. He cared for his people, but he wasn't as kind and gentle to his people as he is now. He punished his people back in the Old Testament.
Right.
When they strayed, he wasn't, I forgive you this time. If I'm going to forgive you, you're going to be punished first.
And the next generation, and your children's generation, and your children's children, and yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we're reading right now during this time about the Exodus in the desert. It came down to trust. His people didn't trust him, and Moses disobeyed him, and God punished him by not allowing him to enter into the promised land.
Right. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Yes, Chris.
I've often thought that our church's movement from the 1940s through Vatican II to today has been this movement change from the penal to the loving. our church that I was born into has certainly evolved into a more passionate, merciful, loving image of God.
And actually, Father Greg just made that point with me during the break, that it was Vatican II, he said, if I'm getting it wrong, step in, that really was kind of the turning point in the way people viewed God, and by extension, I would say viewed the Paschal Mystery. Now, I would say that my understanding of many of the mystics, the Desert Fathers and Mothers, you can also find, you know, very much this aspect, not necessarily in place of this, and I think that's one of the ways to understand this scale, this spectrum, is that, you know, we're not getting rid of this substitutionary atonement idea. It's there. It's how we understand it. And I think the love end of the spectrum is more the completion of what started here. It doesn't necessarily replace it, it completes it. You know, we come to fulfillment in our understanding of what Jesus did for us when we understand it as essentially an act of abundant love.
The way I guess I understand the penal substitution is just self-sacrifice, that, you know, nothing good is easy, and, you know, particularly spiritual enlightenment.
Right.
So there's an element of self-sacrifice, or through, you know, through the experience of sin, you realize, you know, salvation is better. And that's kind of how I try to understand that. I don't know, is that close?
Well, I think it is. It is, however.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and I think probably the add to that, Marty, would be, you know, when you put Jesus and the Paschal Mystery into this exchange, you know, what is that? How do you understand what Jesus did? You know, and if you understand that, as I'll work up to eventually here, that it was really an act of abundant love that brought him to the point of suffering, dying, and rising, and less an act of appeasement, sacrifice, amends making, atonement to God, because God doesn't need that if God is love, is what we really now come to really think more of. Then it's Jesus as, you know, a sacrifice in that way, you know, that is probably not front and center like it was in our earlier understanding of it. And I think it's less maybe to do with our own responsibility for it, which is kind of what I heard you saying, and I think that's present. But when we put Jesus in the mix, it's like, how do we understand, you know, the motivation of Jesus? Was it as a sacrifice?
Well, he
to a
sacrificed
demanding
himself.
God?
I mean, that was the penal substitution. So he sacrificed himself, so, you know, I can, you know, endure this driving around delivering meals on my spare time
Right.
kind of idea.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really how I relate
Good.
to that.
So I'm going to keep pushing through this, because I think that this will be a good part of our conversation when we get to the end of this. So when we talk about this end of the spectrum, if we understand the Paschal Mystery motivation as love, then what we see is what is characteristic of this end, which is always some kind of transaction, some kind of exchange. Okay? What we see on this end, instead, I'm going to go up here, I have more room. Whoops. Instead of transaction, we have transformation on this end. Someone said that earlier. So, transformation. We have fear into hope, sins into forgiveness. The quote I read earlier from the Catechism about the Paschal Mystery being the redemptive plan of Jesus. You know, redemption, has two meanings, and they both are at play here. The action of regaining or gaining possession of something in exchange for a payment or the clearing of a debt. Boom, right? And the other aspect of redemption is the action of saving or being saved as part of a plan, God's plans for the redemption of the world. I would say that's absolutely going on. It is part of God's plan, but God is love, and God's plan is love. God is motivated by love, and it was out of abundant love that Christ endured the Paschal mystery. So I think there's this fulfillment that we see going on historically where we now seem to be more inclined, I would argue, towards the love side of the spectrum. Okay? There's this shift that's going on. So now, over here, the cross is not so much a bloody, or an altar for a bloody sacrifice, as it is a glorious means for God to show God's love for humanity. So if we rephrase this end one more time, we can say, with respect to what's going on here, that we shouldn't think as much about what Jesus did as payment to God on our behalf, but what Jesus as God and man modeled for us through extravagant love. That's the shift I see occurring in our understanding of the Paschal mystery. And the two gifts I mentioned of the Paschal mystery, salvation from sins and the gift of eternal life, think about two of the last things Jesus did on the cross. Forgave his captors. Bless them, Father, they know not what they do. Or forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. And promised eternal life to the repentant thief, right? This day you will be with me in paradise. Both of those things are front and center at that crucial moment. Richard Rohr says this about this shift. The crucified and risen Christ uses the mistakes of the past to create a positive future, a future of redemption instead of retribution. He does not eliminate or punish mistakes. He uses them for transformative purposes. And then about forgiveness specifically, forgiveness, he says, might just be the very best description of what God's goodness engenders in humanity. So less about transaction, more about transformation. Okay? So, this leads up to really why we're here. So my understanding now of Crozier spirituality is that it inclines us towards this end of the spectrum. Okay? Virgil, I believe it was, in one of the associate updates from some months ago, puts it this way. As Crozier people, we underscore the Paschal mystery in a special way. We display our glorious red and white cross as the symbol of the blood, sweat, and tears Jesus expended to establish the kingdom of God's love. Our red and white cross symbolizes the blood and water which flowed out from Jesus' crucified obedience to our God of love. Our red and white cross is a reminder that when we sacrifice ourselves and die to ourselves for the sake of love, we will experience some form of new life. And this is what this leads up to. This is the essence of Christianity. True love, to the point of sacrifice, spawns new life. This is essential for us Crozier people. We wish to highlight and loudly proclaim this central truth of Jesus, the risen Christ.
I watch the Phoenix prayer and Mass, and when Father Jude prays, he ends with, God in love with us.
Mm-hmm.
And I so appreciate that,
Right.
that reminder every time.
Yes, good. I like that too. So Curtis, this I think picks up on what you were mentioning earlier Um, I think it's important to understand that sin originally, meant, missing the mark or falling off the path, right? And so Jesus redeems us because he showed us how to live. This goes back to your comment about basing our spirituality on the life of Jesus, which we have, fortunately, the purview now that people like St. Paul didn't necessarily have. He simply wasn't able to look back on two millennia of tradition and mystical writings and even the Gospels. Everything St. Paul did preceded the Gospels, right? So we have this sense now of Jesus' teaching and preaching and his very life that we can see. And Jesus redeems us by showing us the way. Jesus says he was the way. He took the guesswork out of how to live in the world. When you think about it. If you were lost, off the mark, missing the mark, off the path before Christ, certainly now our understanding of Jesus' life is the real life example for how we are to live. How we are redeemed through modeling Jesus' life. So I think in that respect, the way I think about it is, there seems to me to be a challenge, an invitation, or maybe even a directive built into the Paschal mystery for all of humanity. And that is, live like Jesus lived. That's our directive, right? It's right there in front of us. Live out of Christ consciousness is another way that is becoming more commonly accepted. And so how do we as Croziers do that? Well, I'm going to give you my take, but of course I want our Crozier fathers' take on this as well. From my perspective, we do this by, after the example of Jesus, being a healing presence in the world. Serving the church in the world through ministry and hospitality. Think about the stories of Jesus continually feeding people, ministering not just through his teaching and his preaching, but by the way he lived. His life was a ministry to the world. We do this as Croziers by forgiving. Forgiveness is absolutely tantamount to this spirituality of the cross on this end of the spectrum. We do it by not judging. Can't emphasize that enough. We do it by seeking encounters with people outside of our circle in a spirit of fraternity. Jesus is constantly reaching out to people that were considered on the margins. We should be doing the same thing. And of course we do it by loving, the fulfillment of all of this. And most importantly, I would say that we as Croziers exemplify the Paschal mystery on this end of the spectrum when we take up our crosses with loving perseverance and push through life's difficulties, trusting we will emerge renewed. I don't think I can think of a spirituality of the cross, or what I understand is a Crozier spirituality that I see lived out here and elsewhere, without this notion of taking up our cross, pushing through difficulties, trusting in God that we'll be renewed on the other side. That flow that we talked about in the beginning of the Paschal mystery is absolutely essential. It's the lifeblood of Crozier spirituality as I see it. Another way of saying this is we model encouragement as Croziers. And this trust that through this all that will emerge, that will be renewed, you know, that's what makes us Easter people, right? Alleluia people. And what I love about this time of year to be able to be talking about this is, you know, we hear that great line when we're doing stations, especially. You know, in the world you will have trouble, but stay close to me, I have overcome the world. To me, that's this, in the world you will have trouble, but stay close to me, I have overcome the world. It's that flow again, right? Struggle, death, new life. It seems to come up in so many ways. So if Jesus is the human face of the Creator, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, he said, you know, then we have nothing to fear. To me, that's the real takeaway of the Paschal mystery. Questions, thoughts, before we get to our discussion question? Particularly the Croziers, if you care to comment on the Crozier spirituality part, I would love your thoughts.
Well, in Philippians 2, there is that phrase, let the same mentality of Christ be in you.
Yeah.
And of course, that is a lot of research, a lot of searching, a lot of ups and downs. But it is, let the same mentality be part of you.
Right.
So I think that is, I like that. We have it every Saturday afternoon in Vespers. We sing that. So
Yeah. Yes.
it's a good reminder.
Yes, it is. Thank you for that. What else? Bobby?
This isn't necessarily Crozier, but we've moved from seeing Jesus appeasing the Father by self-sacrifice. I think we now see Jesus as convincing of us of the Father's love through what he went through. I think that's the real message.
Thank you. Yes, that's right. I think and that's, you said better what I was trying to get at when I talked about, you know, love on this end of the spectrum being really kind of the fulfillment of this, not so much a replacement of it, but we begin thinking about it this way and we end up hopefully here. If we don't end up in and with and through and about love, we took a wrong turn somewhere. So, I agree. Thank you for that. Yes, Father?
I like what you said about not judging as part of our witness. When I go to my nephew's gay wedding, and you know, we have him and his partner over family gatherings, they're just part of the family now. We're not judging. We just accept.
Right.
And, yeah, I've always thought that's the best way, although sometimes I wonder, especially, you know, what kind of impression are people getting? Like we think, oh, well, anything goes then, or, but I really think it's the best way to accept people as they are. You know, if they ask you and you want to talk about it, you know, theologically, well, you can talk about it, but when it comes down to what you do, how you encounter people, openness, warmness, acceptance is always the best,
Yes.
rather than confrontation.
Well, and I think it's the most Christ-like. And I think, well,
Yeah.
you know, the gospel coming up tomorrow, you know, it talks about the Samaritan woman at the well, right? So here was a Samaritan, a woman, what? And someone of questionable moral background, Christ, Jesus points out, and she doesn't deny.
Yeah.
And what does he do? He tells her he's the Messiah. He hadn't told anybody else that. What's she do? She brings people to Jesus, it says, literally and figuratively. That makes her the first evangelizer of the Messiah, of the anointed Christ. Well, he's not anointed yet, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
No, I don't think that's any small coincidence. I think if that doesn't display an openness for people on 2 or 3 levels that were not acceptable people at that time, I don't know what does. So in your example, with your nephew, or in other examples where, you know, it's easy to draw a wall around ourselves, forget it. Wall's got to come down if we're going to be Christ-like.
And I'm always surprised at that gospel, because just previously, in the Transfiguration, he forbid his 3 people with him not to say anything. But
Right.
here at the well, he's, go ahead and do it.
Right. Yeah, and then he spends 2 days with them in the house of the Samaritans. So talking about, it's not even, you know, they sometimes wouldn't pass through, and now he's staying with them and presumably teaching and preaching and modeling and all of those things. So yeah, there is that shift there that's probably for another conversation, but it's interesting how that happens, how he goes from wanting to keep things quiet to,
Exposure.
yeah, to being out and open. So it's good. Father?
I've been watching the scene, The Chosen. I don't
Yes,
know,
yes.
that particular scene where Jesus told at the well, when this woman found out that Jesus was the Messiah, and Peter said, "Did you tell him? Did you tell her?" You know, he was really surprised because he was told not to tell,
Right.
but he already recognized it. When I was a pastor, I tried to live. People care more. They don't care what you know, but they want to care. They want to know how much you care.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care what you know, but they want to know what you care.
Yes.
And also accept people where they're at. So
Yeah, well, I mean, that's certainly what's being modeled by Pope Francis as well,
Yeah.
right?
I
You know,
like
being
that too.
pastoral first.
I think he should be honorary closure.
There you go.
So.
Other
Okay.
thoughts?
The Crozier emphasis on the glorious cross, the glorious part of that, and their crucifix in the church of the risen Christ superimposed on the cross, so to speak, talks about Crozier evolution as well, because in the 40s they didn't foster the image that they are now preaching and visiting and, you know, evidencing.
Okay.
So this Paschal mystery, I love that you said it's a pattern in our life, and it's archetypal, meaning that it started with Abraham and continues and continues, and the everlasting part. And what came to mind is universal.
Mm-hmm.
How universal this experience is. And the fact when you mentioned we are an Alleluia people, we have not exhibited that very well from time to time.
Agreed.
We speak it, but we don't exhibit it very well. And I want to know, Scott, what political role are you campaigning for? If this is our Christian country and this is our foundation, how come our Christian country doesn't exhibit that in our leadership vision? It just amazes me that that is so far from our own experience here right now.
Well, that's an interesting question, but let's keep it rhetorical for today at least, because I don't know and don't
Yeah.
want to wade into those waters, but it's, you know, a question that we could probably talk about it, maybe even at one of our associate meetings, is the disconnects and the connects between what we preach and believe and we're rooted in, and where we are with our leadership and our expectations of leadership. Because I think there are a lot of paradoxes almost in what we say and sometimes heartfelt believe, and then what we actually want in others or in leaders particularly. You know, the characteristics might be different. But yeah, let's keep that for another conversation. But you were moving in the direction that I'd like us to end in now, because I said, you know, the Paschal Mystery is a thing you can talk about. It has elements and all that, but it's experiential. The whole concept is an experiential concept, whether it was Jesus' experience or our own. You know, this flow we talked about of suffering through something and emerging in a new and better place or new and better self at the end is something that I think all of us experience throughout our lives. I think, going back, Curtis, to what you mentioned before, I kind of think that pattern is sort of weaved into the fabric of being. I think that's the way the world works. I think that's the way the natural world often works, if we start to talk about some of those things. But I just want to open up to people who are interested in sharing. You know, so my actual question was, when have you experienced some kind of suffering through hardship that brought you to a new and better place? I just want to open it up, and we have 15 minutes or so for people who are willing to share. I'll go first with a very short example in my own life. When I thought of that question, I had to think myself, so when have I? And the first example that came to my mind was, happened probably 10 years or so ago. I had my godmother still alive, late 80s. I had one child who lived in Canada, so she, in essence, was alone. Husband passed away years before. And, you know, my wife and I kind of took her on. We became her caretakers. Now, I had a wife, 3 kids, a job, my own aging parents. You know, this wasn't necessarily something I was looking to do, but I loved her, she loved us, it just happened. And it was hard. A lot of times for the 5 years or so it happened, it was hard. Doctor's appointments, hospital stays, fixing this, running her there, you know. I mean, anybody who's been in there knows what's involved in that. And when she eventually passed away, well into her 90s, I just remember having this weird kind of mix of feelings of satisfaction almost, not that she was gone, but that satisfaction, pride, you know, that I stepped up and actually did what I should have done when so many times I didn't feel like doing it, or it would have been easy for me to make an excuse or something. And, you know, my wife and I think, made her last years so much more enjoyable by our presence. And I don't know, I took some satisfaction in that. I felt like at the end of all of that, I was a better person than I was before I started it, just having gone through that. Right? So for me, that was a real life moment where the Paschal Mystery played out in my life. I could have dodged it. Jesus could have run away. He could have escaped at any time. Right? But the fact that things played out like they did, and played out like they did in my example, you know, brought me to a better place, made me a better person. So that was my example. Who else? Father?
So, some years ago I was suspended from ministry because I was accused of molesting a little girl, and I never did it. But so somebody else did it, not me. But an insight came along that prompted me to ask God to let what I was going through in somebody else's place would be a benefit to him eternally.
Hmm.
So that's, in a sense, that's doing what Jesus did.
Yeah, recycling, that notion of recycling sin into forgiveness, you know, mirrors what you're talking about. That's powerful, and I'm sure that was not easy to do, but that's a powerful example. Anyone else have any?
I have a story.
Yeah.
I grew up in a little bit of craziness. I got married and I had a child, and that child was born dead. It took 16 minutes for them to get him to breathe. And then he spent the next 4 years or so in and out of the university hospital. Every 6 weeks he was in and out of the hospital. My mother and my husband's mother both agreed that he should have just died. It would have been less trouble.
Mm.
And one time I have a sister who's a Bible-thumping Lutheran, and she happened to call me one day just as we had come back from the hospital with him. And she started in about God this and God that and God everything, and I was mad at God. I was so angry at God. This child had done nothing to deserve this. And I literally said to her that day, I can hardly wait to meet that SOB. And I used the words, not the letters, about God. Oh, you're going to hell. And I said, I'm already there. You know, I'm dreaming at night that my son is dying. I wake up and I go back to sleep and he's in the coffin again, and it's over and over. And I just didn't know what to do with this. But when I said I'm already there, I realized God already knew the struggles I was going through. My relationship with God changed when I owned how angry I was at him. That I could hardly wait to ask him why, you know. So my relationship with God changed. And then when I went through RCIA, I started in '95, so that Holy Friday, Curtis and I went to church and we were going to be venerating the cross, and I'm going, that's no big deal. Because we had never done it as Lutheran. I didn't, you know, when I got to the cross and I knelt, it was something very different that I had, you know, it was. So I have begun over the years in my life experience to realize how much love. I've been at the love pretty much all along, because that's the only way I survived, is he had to love me no matter what, that I survived that stuff. And my son grew up to be a special ed teacher working with kids who have disabilities, you know, so God had a plan.
Yeah.
I didn't know what it was.
Right.
And you know, so there it is. That's my transition from there to the love.
Well, and as the piece I read said, in the end, beauty and love win, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's wonderful. I'm glad for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I am recently moving into a new awareness. And when you said trusting the way, it renews us. Trusting the way, and I like what Father Jim said, belief, somehow faith, which encompasses our whole being. But in my prayer of late, I am, through dream work, my dreams are revealing to me new dimensions, and I'm doing it consciously now with a spiritual director, doing dream work and coming to amazing awarenesses. Some of them very simple, an issue between my wife and me, and waking up in the morning and say, aha, that's what I need to do. And it's a process right now. I'm not through to the glorious part yet. But I'm saying there is a new consciousness awakening in me through prayer that says to me, this way, the way of Jesus, I'm moving from not knowing, because that's how I've named myself recently, as the one who doesn't know. And you mentioned not knowing at one point. That strikes me. Not to knowing, but to trusting. And this Pascal mystery, since it is so archetypical, it must apply to me too. And my experience, the word today is experience, Scott. You use that again and again. It's our experience. We know the truth in our hearts because we've lived it. And to bring it to consciousness, to try to put words to it, is the treat, the blessing, the gift. And as I say, I'm just unwrapping that in a new way now.
That's interesting. Thank you. Any other thoughts, Pascal mystery experiences in your own life you care to share?
I will.
Okay.
Well, as I told you earlier, got married later in life, and my wife was considerably younger than I was. And we had a fantastic relationship, a fantastic marriage. And suddenly she became ill, was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, and with 8 months passed away at 45 years of age. And people would say to me, I bet you're really angry with God. And I said, no, I'm not angry with God. It was Adam's sin. And her death made me love God more, to worship Him more, to get more involved, to learn more, to do more good things, to fulfill my life as a person, to spread the word of the Lord. And I really, really find it that it was God's plan. Didn't want it to happen. I'm sure God didn't want it to happen either, but it was part of the order of life. So it made me a better person, a stronger person, a better Christian, a better lover of the Lord. The devil loses.
Devil loses. That's beautiful, and thank you for that. Any other thoughts anyone has? Bring this to a close. Buddy?
I was transferred one time. I didn't like where I was going to go, or that I was being moved, but turned out to be the best place.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, just that experience of ugh
Yeah.
to pushing through it to, oh, right? I
Yeah.
mean, how many times do we do that? Every day, it seems like, for me at least. But certainly at identifiable periods in our life, that's absolutely there. It's just, it's so interesting how it works, but yeah. Glad that worked out for you.
Didn't do it by myself.
Right? No, I understand. Okay, well, thank you. My hope with all of this was that, throughout this, something, if it tweaked you, that's maybe a sign to do a little more research about a concept, of an idea, hopefully with a little better understanding of my understanding of Crozer spirituality weaved in, this will just be kind of step one towards deeper understanding or a deeper connection to the Pascal mystery as we hear that phrase, live that reality, and experience those Pascal mystery moments in our life as we go forward. Use that rich concept to bring us closer to God. Okay, thank you.
Doug.